I was suffocating inside my own chest when my sister tore the oxygen line from my face. "Quit pretending," Maggie snapped, her manicured nails grazing my cheek as she yanked. "You just want sympathy." The air disappeared. My chest folded inward like a crushed soda can. I clawed at the bare space where the tube had been, my vision flooding with black spots, my throat making sounds I didn't recognize, frantic animal gasps that bounced off the hospital walls. My parents stood 3 feet away. They said nothing. My mother folded her arms. My father stared at his phone. I reached toward them, hand shaking, pleading without words. "Help me, please. I'm your daughter." Maggie rolled her eyes. "She's fine. Just dramatic as always." What none of them knew, what would shatter everything they believed about our family, was that someone was standing right behind them in the doorway. And 2 weeks later, at our grandfather's will reading, that man would rest his hand on my sister's shoulder and say 6 words that destroyed her entire world. "Have you ever been invisible to the people who were supposed to love you most? My name is Emily Warren. I'm 35 years old, a healthcare consultant who helps hospitals improve how they run. I've built a solid career in Denver, owned my own condo, and control my chronic lung disease with strict discipline. None of my family knows any of this because none of them have ever bothered to ask. I grew up as the unseen daughter in a family that only noticed my younger sister. From the time I was 8 years old and Maggie was 2, I learned that my role was to be strong, independent, and low maintenance. Maggie was fragile. Maggie needed constant attention. Maggie required shielding from a world that might bruise her delicate feelings. I was expected to absorb whatever life threw at me without complaint because that's what big sisters do. Grandfather William was the only exception. When I was 12, he found me crying behind his tool shed after my parents forgot my birthday for Maggie's dance recital. He knelt down, brushed away my tears with his rough hands, and said something I've carried ever since. "April, you are a gem hidden in darkness. One day the light will find you." I didn't fully grasp what he meant then. I think I'm only starting to understand now. When grandfather died 2 weeks ago, I drove 4 hours from Denver to Colorado Springs for his funeral. I stood in the back of the church while Maggie sobbed theatrically in the front pew, surrounded by relatives offering tissues and warm embraces. My mother told everyone that Maggie had been such a comfort to Dad in his final days while I had been too busy with work to visit. The truth was that no one told me grandfather was failing until 3 days before he died. By the time I arrived, he was already gone. After the service, Maggie cornered me near the coat closet. Her eyes were dry despite the show she'd put on minutes earlier. Snorts. She leaned in, her perfume overpowering, and whispered with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Grandfather left everything to me. April, the house, the investments, everything. You should get used to that." He patted my cheek like I was a child. Some of us were actually there for him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that I'd called grandfather every Sunday for 15 years. That we talked about books and history and the meaning of life while she was busy posting pictures of herself online. But I said nothing. I never did. That was my role. The stress of the funeral, the grief, the altitude shift from Denver, my lungs couldn't handle it. That night, I woke at 2 a.m. unable to breathe, my chest locked tight as if iron bands had been cinched around my ribs. I called 911 and was taken to St. Mary's Hospital where doctors admitted me to the ICU and put me on oxygen. When my family showed up the next morning, I expected worry. What I got instead was annoyance. My mother stood at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed. "April, you always make everything complicated. We have the will reading to deal with. Your father has to handle the estate paperwork." Maggie inspected her manicure. "He's probably faking it anyway. She always did love attention." I tried to explain that COPD wasn't something you could pretend to have, that my oxygen levels had dropped to a dangerous point, but my mother only sighed and said they'd come back later after taking care of more important things. It was Maggie who stayed behind. She said she'd keep me company. But the second our parents disappeared down the hall, her expression shifted. She glanced at the door, making sure we were alone. That was when she tore the breathing tube from my face. And that was when the door opened behind her. Dr. Marcus Keller stood in the doorway, his face unreadable as he watched my sister step away from my bed. He moved fast, reconnecting my oxygen, checking my vitals, his hands calm and practiced. But when he turned to Maggie, his voice was cold as steel. "What did you just do?" Maggie stammered something about the tube being loose. But I saw something flash in Dr. Keller's eyes. something that told me this wasn't the first time he'd seen cruelty inside this family. Keller ordered Maggie to leave immediately. She protested, insisted it was a misunderstanding, said the tube had only come loose, but Keller's expression stayed stone cold, and eventually Maggie grabbed her purse and stormed out, muttering about ungrateful sisters and wasted time. I lay there shaking, my throat burning, my thoughts spiraling with questions I couldn't turn into words. Keller checked my vitals twice, adjusted my oxygen flow, and told me to rest. But rest was impossible when the person who was supposed to be my sister had just tried to suffocate me. The next morning, after the doctors finished their rounds and my family sent word they were too busy with estate matters to visit, Keller came back to my room. He pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down with the heaviness of someone carrying a long burden. He asked how I was feeling. I told him the truth. Physically, I was improving. Emotionally, I was shattered. He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I realized. Then he said something that changed everything. He told me that meeting me there was not a coincidence. He had known my grandfather, William Warren, for 5 years. William had been his patient, coming in regularly for heart checkups and later for the surgery that was meant to give him more time. During those years they talked about many things. Family, regrets, the people William loved, and the people who worried him. My name came up often. I stared at him, struggling to process what I was hearing. Keller went on. He said that 3 years earlier, during one of their appointments, William had made an unusual request. He asked Keller to watch over me if I ever ended up at St. Mary's. William knew about my lung condition. He knew Colorado Springs was my hometown, that I might come back someday and need care here. He wanted someone on my side. Keller remembered exactly what William had said. April is the granddaughter my family forgot. She has no one in her corner. If anything ever happens to her, please be there. Keller had promised, never expecting the day would really come until last week when he saw my name on the admission list. I couldn't speak. My grandfather had remembered me. He had prepared for me. He had asked someone outside the family to look out for me because he knew my own relatives never would. Keller reached into his jacket and took out a folder. He said William had handed it to him 6 months earlier with clear instructions to give it to me when the moment came. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed features, pages from professional journals. Every single one of them was about me. One article detailed how my consulting work helped Denver Memorial Hospital avoid financial collapse 3 years ago. Another highlighted an interview where I talked about efficiency strategies for struggling medical centers. There were dozens of pieces covering nearly a decade of my career. In the margins, in handwriting I recognized from old birthday cards, my grandfather had written notes. My granddaughter did this. So proud of her. She built this life completely on her own. The tears came before I could stop them. For 35 years I believed no one in my family ever noticed me. I believed I was invisible, easily forgotten, undeserving of pride or recognition. But my grandfather had been watching the entire time. He had gathered proof of my accomplishments like priceless keepsakes. He had carried my successes in his heart even when he couldn't say it to me directly. The realization cracked something open inside me, something sealed shut for decades. Keller gave me a moment to steady myself. Then his expression turned serious again. He said there was more I needed to hear. William had confided in him about Maggie too, and the truth was ugly. My sister had made disastrous financial choices 2 years earlier. She had poured money into a business venture that failed completely, leaving her almost $200,000 in debt. She hid it from everyone, keeping up her lifestyle with credit cards and borrowed cash, sinking further every month. William discovered the truth when creditors began calling his home looking for her. Maggie saw the inheritance as her only escape. She needed that money desperately. She needed it so badly she would do nearly anything to make sure it was hers. Suddenly, Maggie's behavior made a different kind of sense. The cruelty wasn't just sibling jealousy or rivalry. It was desperation. She was a drowning woman grabbing for anything that might keep her afloat, and I was standing between her and the life raft she believed she deserved. The door opened and a woman in scrubs walked in. She introduced herself as Rosa Martinez, the night nurse taking over the evening shift. She was around 50, with gentle eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. She checked my monitors, asked how I was feeling, then looked at Keller with quiet meaning. She said softly that she needed to tell him something. She had been at the door the day before when it happened. She saw everything. She saw my sister rip the tube from my face and stand there watching me struggle for air. Keller asked if she would be willing to testify about what she witnessed. Rosa didn't hesitate. She said she had a 78-year-old mother at home. If anyone ever did something like that to her mother, she would never forgive them. She would absolutely testify. Then Rosa looked at me and something in her expression changed. She said there was something else I needed to know. She had worked at this hospital for more than 20 years, and she remembered patients and their families. She remembered my grandfather. She had been on duty the night he died. My blood turned cold. Rosa lowered her voice. She said that night my sister Maggie came to visit late, around 11. She insisted on being alone with him. At the time, Rosa thought it was touching, a granddaughter wanting private moments with her dying grandfather. But after what she had seen the day before, she wasn't so sure anymore. Your sister was there that night, Rosa said slowly. Alone with him. And by morning he was gone. Her words lingered in the room like a heavy shadow. I asked her to tell me everything she could remember about that night. She pulled a chair closer and spoke in a calm, even voice. She said my grandfather had been recovering well after his heart surgery. His vitals were steady. The doctors believed he would be released within a week. Then Maggie arrived around 11 that night, saying she wanted some quiet time alone with him. Rosa thought it was touching. She let Maggie into the room and continued her rounds. About 30 minutes later, the monitor began screaming. Rosa rushed back to find my grandfather had stopped breathing. She called the emergency team immediately, but it was already too late. What disturbed her most was Maggie's reaction. Most families panic when something like that happens. They cry, they scream, they beg for help. Maggie just sat in the chair by the window, completely calm, watching the medical team work on a man who was already gone. And there was more. When Rosa checked the equipment during the chaos, she noticed the breathing tube had been shifted from its proper position. It wasn't fully removed, just moved enough to restrict airflow. She reported it to her supervisor, but nothing came of it. Elderly patients sometimes move in their sleep. Equipment shifts. These things happen. Rosa paused and looked at me with exhausted eyes. She said she had no direct proof of anything. She couldn't accuse anyone based on what she saw, but she knew something wasn't right. And apparently my grandfather knew it too. Because after Maggie's first visit earlier that week, he immediately asked the nurses to contact his lawyer. He changed his will 3 days before he died. I turned to Keller and asked the question burning in my chest. Would Maggie ever face charges for what she might have done to my grandfather? Keller was honest with me. He said probably not. There was no solid evidence, no witnesses to the exact moment, nothing that would stand up in court. The displaced tube could be explained as an accident. Maggie would deny everything, and without proof, no prosecutor would touch the case. But Keller reminded me that William had known something was wrong. That was why he changed his will. That was why he had prepared for the possibility that Maggie might go too far. I lay there absorbing everything. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel sad or defeated. I felt angry, a cold, focused anger that sharpened my thoughts instead of blurring them. I didn't want revenge through the legal system. I didn't want to spend years fighting battles I couldn't win. What I wanted was the truth. I wanted my family to face what they had allowed to happen, what they had chosen to ignore for decades. I looked at Keller and Rosa and asked them directly. Would they help me? Would they stand with me? When the moment came to reveal everything, Keller nodded without hesitation. Rosa reached out and squeezed my hand. She said she would be honored to help. The next day, my family arrived demanding that I leave the hospital early. My mother complained about the cost. My father muttered about scheduling conflicts with the lawyer, and Maggie shockingly acted sweeter than she had in years. She sat on the edge of my bed and said she had been so worried about me. She said I should come home and rest properly before the will reading. She even offered to make me soup. I looked into her eyes and saw the calculation behind the act. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of losing control. For the first time in my life, I didn't give in. I didn't apologize, adjust, or shrink myself to keep everyone comfortable. I told her I would leave when my doctor cleared me and not 1 second before. Something crossed Maggie's face, maybe confusion or the first real spark of fear. She wasn't used to me resisting. I was released 2 days later, steady enough to walk on my own and breathe without assistance. Before I left, Keller handed me a sealed envelope. He said my grandfather had given it to him months earlier with precise instructions. I was only meant to open it when I truly needed it. I unfolded it carefully and found a handwritten note in my grandfather's familiar script. April, you are the only one in this family with a kind heart. Don't let them steal that from you. I read the words 3 times, feeling his love reach me across death itself. He had been preparing for this moment the whole time. He knew what was coming and he made sure I wouldn't face it alone. The will reading was set for 10 a.m. at Thomas Reed's law office downtown. When I arrived, my parents and Maggie were already seated, looking impatient and entitled. The door opened and I walked in. But I wasn't alone. Dr. Marcus Keller and Nurse Rosa Martinez followed behind me. Maggie's face drained of color. She demanded to know why I had brought strangers into a private family matter. Her voice was sharp, but I could hear the shake beneath it. Thomas Reed, the attorney and my grandfather's friend of 40 years, answered before I could. He explained that William had specifically requested their presence in his written instructions. This was not my decision. This was my grandfather's final request. Reed asked everyone to sit. He was tall, silver-haired, reading glasses balanced on his nose, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many family secrets unfold. He began by explaining that William had been very clear about how this meeting was to proceed. He wanted every family member present. He wanted witnesses. And he wanted certain truths revealed before his estate was finalized. Maggie sat with her arms crossed, still convinced everything would fall her way. My parents exchanged uneasy looks, clearly disturbed by Keller and Rosa's presence. Reed opened the first document and began reading. The primary residence, valued at approximately $800,000, would be divided equally among 3 parties: Linda Warren, Richard Warren, and April Warren. He paused. Maggie's name was missing. Maggie jumped to her feet immediately. She insisted there had to be an error. Grandfather had promised her the house. He told her she would be taken care of. Reed looked at her calmly over his glasses and asked her to sit down. There was more. Maggie's confidence visibly fractured, but she dropped back into her chair, fists clenched. Reed then turned to Keller and asked him to speak. My parents looked confused, but Maggie's face had gone from pale to ashen. Keller stood and addressed the room in a steady, controlled voice. He explained he had been William Warren's physician for 5 years. During that time, William had spoken to him about family, concerns, and hopes. William had asked Keller to watch over me if I ever required care at St. Mary's. He said I was the granddaughter the family forgot and that he wanted someone on my side. Then Keller described what he had witnessed 3 days earlier. He had entered my hospital room to find Maggie standing over my bed. She had just torn the breathing tube from my face. I was choking, gasping, unable to breathe, and Maggie stood there watching. He stepped in at once and saved my life. He looked straight at Maggie as he spoke and she couldn't hold his gaze. Rosa stood beside him. Her voice was softer but just as firm. She confirmed she had been at the doorway and witnessed everything. He saw Maggie pull out my breathing tube. She saw Maggie make no move to call for help. Then Rosa added something that made my mother gasp. She said she had also been working the night William died. She explained how Maggie arrived late, demanded to be alone with grandfather, and shut the door. 30 minutes later, the monitors went off. When Rosa rushed in, she found the breathing tube out of place and Maggie sitting calmly by the window, showing no concern at all. Maggie screamed that they were lying. She said this was all a setup against her, that I had paid these people to ruin her name. Reed raised his hand to quiet the room. He produced a folder containing hospital hallway camera footage and nursing notes documenting the displaced equipment. The proof was undeniable. Keller stood again and walked slowly toward Maggie. The room went completely silent. He placed his hand on the table directly in front of her and leaned in. Then he said 6 words that felt like time itself froze. "I saw what you did, Hannah." She went still like a deer in headlights. Keller continued without breaking eye contact. He said it wasn't only what she did to me. It was what she did to grandfather as well. Reed opened a second envelope and explained that William had written a letter specifically for Maggie, to be read only at this gathering. He began reading aloud. "Hannah, I loved you the wrong way. I loved you with silence and false hope. I thought if I gave you enough you would learn to love others. I was wrong. I don't know exactly what you did, but I know what you didn't do. You didn't love your sister. You didn't respect me. You only ever saw what you could take. If you're reading this letter, it means you still haven't changed. I hope someday you'll understand that love cannot be bought and forgiveness cannot be demanded." Maggie broke down, but not in regret. She screamed that it wasn't fair, that she deserved that money, that grandfather had no right to judge her. My mother rushed to defend her, saying Maggie was just impulsive, that she never meant any harm. Keller stopped her. He asked my parents directly if they had known Maggie had serious problems for years. The silence that followed answered him. My father finally spoke, his voice cracked. He said they believed that if they loved Maggie enough, she would eventually change. I finally found my voice. I asked them, "What about me? Didn't I deserve to be loved too?" Neither of them replied. Reed cleared his throat and opened the final envelope. He announced there was one last section of the will. William had set this part aside specifically for me. He read the terms aloud. The room fell silent. As Reed read grandfather's final gift to me, with every word I felt something loosen in my chest. William had left me the mountain retreat house in Estes Park, a beautiful property valued at $400,000. In his instructions, he wrote that this was the place where I could finally breathe freely, away from the family that had suffocated me for so long. He had also created a healthcare trust of $150,000 dedicated solely to my ongoing medical care, ensuring I would never worry about affording the treatment my lungs needed. And finally, he left me his entire rare book collection, the same worn volumes we read together when I was a child, spending summer afternoons in his study, escaping into worlds where daughters were cherished and families truly loved one another. The room stayed locked in stunned silence. Maggie looked like she might fold in on herself. Her face shifted from pale to gray to a sickly green, and her hands clenched the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles pushed out like small stones under her skin. My parents stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes, suddenly captivated by the pattern in the carpet beneath their shoes. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the soft ticking of the antique clock on Reed's bookshelf, marking each second of their shared disgrace. Reed reached into his folder again and pulled out one final envelope. This one was addressed to me personally in my grandfather's handwriting. He slid it across the polished mahogany table and I took it with shaking fingers. The paper felt delicate and sacred, like holding a piece of my grandfather himself. I opened it slowly, careful not to damage anything, and unfolded the letter inside. His familiar handwriting filled the page, slightly unsteady with age, yet unmistakably his. My dearest April, he had written, "You are the gem hidden in darkness that I spoke of so many years ago when you were just a sad little girl crying behind my tool shed. I have watched you grow into an extraordinary woman despite everything stacked against you. And my heart has swelled with pride at every success you earned through your own strength and determination. I am sorry I did not protect you sooner. I am sorry I did not stand up to your parents and demand they treat you fairly. I was old and afraid to confront my own children about how they failed you. I told myself that keeping peace mattered more than telling the truth. I convinced myself things would fix themselves, that your mother and father would eventually see what I saw in you. I was wrong, and I will carry that regret with me into whatever comes next. But through this I want you to finally hear what I should have said out loud every single day of your life. I always saw you, April. I was always proud of you. You built a beautiful life despite every obstacle. And you did it with grace and dignity your sister will never understand. Live for yourself now, not for anyone's approval, not for anyone's permission, not for the hope that one day your family will love you the way you deserve. The light has finally found you, my precious girl. Step into it and never look back, with all my love forever, and always, your grandfather who adores you." I couldn't stop the tears. They dropped onto the page, blurring some of the words, and I didn't care. For 35 years, I believed I was invisible and worthless to my family. For 35 years, I worked harder, achieved more, and asked for less, hoping someone would finally notice. Now I held proof that the person who mattered most had seen me all along. He had loved me. He had been proud of me. He had saved articles about my career and written notes of admiration in the margins. And he had found a way to tell me everything I needed to hear, even after death took his voice. Reed gave me a moment to steady myself before clearing his throat and speaking to the room again. His voice turned formal, almost clinical. He explained that based on the testimony provided by Dr. Keller and Nurse Martinez, I had solid legal grounds to pursue a civil lawsuit against Maggie for assault resulting in bodily harm. The evidence was clear and well documented. I could also file a police report that could lead to criminal charges being investigated. The hospital had preserved the hallway camera footage. The nursing notes were official medical records. Combined with 2 reliable witnesses, the case against Maggie was solid. Maggie's composure broke completely. She sprang from her chair and rushed toward me, dropping to her knees beside my seat like a petitioner before a queen. She grabbed my hands before I could pull away and begged me not to do this to her. She said she was sorry, that she never meant any of it, that the stress from her financial problems had overwhelmed her, that she hadn't been thinking clearly. She said we were sisters, that blood was thicker than water, that families were supposed to forgive one another. She begged me to think about what pressing charges would do to our parents, to our family's reputation, to the memory of grandfather himself. Tears ran down her face, smearing her expensive makeup, and for a brief moment she almost looked genuine. I let her finish. I let her use up every excuse and justification and manipulation she had left. Then I calmly pulled my hands free and gave her my answer. I told her I would not sue her. I would not press charges. I would not pursue any legal action against her at all. Her eyes filled with relief and she started to thank me, but I raised my hand to stop her. I explained that my choice had nothing to do with forgiveness or mercy or sisterly affection. I was choosing not to take legal action because I refused to spend another day of my life carrying resentment toward her. She had already taken too much from me. She had taken my childhood peace. She had taken my sense of belonging. She had taken 35 years of believing I was somehow less deserving of love than she was. She would not take my future peace too. I would not give her that power. But I also made something else very clear. From that day on, Maggie was no longer my sister. I wanted no contact with her. No calls, no messages, no holidays, no pretending at family bonds that had never truly existed. She was a stranger to me now. And that was how she would remain for the rest of our lives. She would face her $200,000 in debt completely on her own. She would have to explain to our aunts and uncles and cousins why grandfather had removed her from his will. She would live every day knowing that everyone in that room now knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Those were her consequences. They would follow her like shadows for the rest of her life. And unlike a lawsuit that might end after a few years, those consequences would never expire. Maggie stared at me with something between hatred and despair. She opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. She had finally run out of manipulations. She staggered back to her chair and sank into it, broken in a way I had never seen before. I felt nothing. No pleasure in her suffering. No pity for her situation. Only a quiet emptiness where pain and anger once lived. My parents tried to speak next. My mother leaned forward with wet eyes and said she hadn't realized things were this bad between Maggie and me. She said she was sorry, that she never intended for any of this to happen, that she loved both her daughters equally and had always tried her best. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I told her she had known. She had always known. Every time Maggie mocked me and she said nothing. Every time my achievements were ignored while Maggie's smallest efforts were praised. Every time I asked for help and was told to handle it myself because I was the strong one, she knew. She simply chose not to see because seeing would have required her to act, and acting would have meant confronting Maggie. And confronting Maggie was something she had never been willing to do. My mother had no reply. She sat there with tears sliding down her face, finally facing the truth she had avoided for decades. My father cleared his throat and asked whether I could ever forgive them. His voice broke as he asked. I thought about it carefully before responding. I told him I needed time, maybe a very long time, possibly years. I wasn't cutting them off entirely the way I was cutting off Maggie, but I was finally putting firm boundaries in place that should have existed decades earlier. Snorts. If they wanted me in their lives from that point on, they would have to show it through consistent actions over time, not hollow words spoken during a crisis. They would have to earn back the trust they had spent 35 years tearing apart. Whether they were capable of that was something only time would reveal. 3 months later, I moved into my grandfather's mountain retreat. The house rested on a wooded hillside overlooking the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by tall pine trees and clean, crisp air that my damaged lungs welcomed like a gift of healing. Every morning, I woke to birdsong and wind moving through the branches instead of traffic and sirens. Every evening, I watched the sun sink behind the peaks, painting them in gold, crimson, and deep purple. I arranged my grandfather's book collection in the study exactly as he had kept it, alphabetized by author with his favorites closest to the reading chair. I could almost sense him there with me, nodding in quiet approval. I began writing not for revenge, not to expose my family or seek public punishment. I started writing a memoir about my journey because I knew there were other women who had been forgotten by their families too. Women who had spent their entire lives feeling unseen. Women who had been told they were too sensitive, too dramatic, too demanding when all they ever wanted was the same love freely given to others. Women who needed to know they were not alone and that survival was possible. If my story could help even one of them find the strength to walk away from toxic relationships, then everything I had endured would have meaning. Keller became a trusted friend during those months. We met for coffee once a month at a small cafe in town, and he shared stories about my grandfather I had never heard. How William had worried about me constantly during appointments, asking Keller hypothetical questions about lung conditions and treatment options. How he spoke about my accomplishments with open pride to anyone who would listen, showing those collected articles to nurses and receptionists. How he spent his final years quietly setting plans in motion to protect me even after he was gone. Those conversations healed me in ways I hadn't expected. They gave me back pieces of my grandfather that death had tried to take. One quiet afternoon in early autumn, I stood on the balcony watching the last golden light fade behind the mountain peaks. I held my grandfather's favorite book in my hands, a worn volume of poetry he used to read to me when I was little, and the world felt full of possibility. The binding was soft from decades of loving use. I opened it carefully to the first page and found an inscription I had somehow never noticed, written in his handwriting 20 years earlier when I was just 15. For April, my strong little girl, someday you will understand your own worth. I smiled. For the first time in my 35 years, I think I finally did. My phone rang, breaking the quiet. I glanced at the screen and saw Rosa's number. I answered, and her warm voice came through, barely holding back excitement. She said she had just spoken with a journalist from a major women's magazine who had somehow learned about what happened at St. Mary's Hospital. The journalist wasn't interested in gossip or scandal. She wanted to tell my story as a message of hope, a light for other women who had been made invisible by the families that were supposed to protect them. Rosa asked whether I wanted to speak with her further. I looked out the window toward the mountains my grandfather loved, the mountains he left to me, so I could finally breathe without my family's indifference pressing on my chest. Give her my number, I said. The light had finally reached me and I was ready to let it be seen. And so April's story reaches its end, yet in many ways it is only beginning. She spent 35 years believing she was unseen, believing she was somehow less deserving of love than her sister, believing that no matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved, she would never be enough for the people who were meant to love her without conditions. It took losing her grandfather to realize she had never been invisible at all. The one person who truly mattered had seen her the whole time. He had watched her become an extraordinary woman. He had gathered proof of her achievements like priceless keepsakes. And when he knew his time was limited, he made sure to leave her not only an inheritance of money and property, but something far more valuable than the certainty that she had always been worthy of love. April chose grace instead of revenge. She could have destroyed Maggie in court. She could have pursued criminal charges and watched her sister face the full weight of her cruelty. But April understood something Maggie never will. Revenge is a chain that ties you to the person who hurt you. Forgiveness, even when it is undeserved, is the key that frees you. April did not forgive Maggie because Maggie deserved it. She let go of that weight because she refused to carry it any longer. And by doing so, she finally stepped into the light her grandfather had always promised would find her. This story is for every woman who has ever felt invisible within her own family. For every daughter who worked twice as hard and received half the recognition. For every sister who was expected to be strong while someone else was allowed to be fragile. For every woman who looked around the dinner table and wondered why her accomplishments were never celebrated the way others were. You are not alone. Your feelings are valid. And your worth is not defined by whether your family chooses to see it. I want to hear from you now. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your family? Have you ever loved someone who seemed incapable of loving you back the same way? Have you ever had to walk away from people who should have protected you in order to finally protect yourself? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and there are thousands of other women watching this video who need to know they are not the only ones who have felt this way. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply say, "Me too," and let someone else know they are not alone in their pain. If April's journey touched your heart today, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel. We share stories like this every week. Stories about women who overcome impossible circumstances. Women who find their strength after years of being told they were weak. Women who finally learn to love themselves after a lifetime of being unloved by others. When you subscribe and turn on notifications, you become part of a community of women supporting women, lifting each other up and reminding one another that our worth is not defined by those who fail to see it. Please take a moment to tap the like button if this story touched you. That small gesture helps more women discover these stories when they need them most. And share this video with someone you care about, someone who might need to hear that they too are a gem hidden in darkness, waiting for the light to reach them. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for opening your heart to April's story. And thank you for being part of this incredible community. Until next time, remember, you are seen, you are valued, and you are worthy of love. The light is coming for you too. You just have to be brave enough to step into it when it arrives. I will see you in the next story.